How to Let Go of Deep Resentment. A Zen sleep story. A hot, smoldering current of friction is circulating through your chest right now because you are replaying an old betrayal, a biting remark, or an unfair situation that left your sense of justice completely violated. You are lying in the dark, but your jaw is locked tight and your temples are pulsing with a fierce subterranean heat as your mind repeatedly drafts arguments, seeking vindication against someone who may not even be thinking of you. There is a sharp, burning resentment in your stomach that views this lingering fury as an emergency that must be instantly resolved through a mental victory. This inner furnace keeps you completely rigid, fanning the flames of an old grievance until your entire body feels like an overcooked branch ready to burst into an open fire. Let the specific, stabilizing atmosphere of this room begin to cool your overworked perspective. The air around your bed carries the damp, grounding scent of forest soil, green moss, and the faint, sweet trace of distant wood smoke, a restorative, primeval aroma from a clearing where heavy materials are allowed to cool beneath the earth without any demand to perform. Beneath you, the mattress provides a dense, unyielding baseline, offering a heavy foundation that completely releases you from the burden of defending your past or justifying your anger. The tight, hyper-vigilant muscles across your collarbones and throat can finally surrender their alignment. Right now, dear friend, you are safe enough to soften. You are not broken because your heart is burning with resentment, and what you are feeling tonight is not a personal failure. It is simply the natural weight of an injury that has not yet found its place to rest. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and you do not have to solve your whole life tonight. Consider a surprising paradox that sits at the very core of this Latinite anger spiral. The intense heat running through your chest is not an enemy that must be violently extinguished or hidden away in shame. We are conditioned to believe that to achieve inner peace, we must immediately eliminate every trace of frustration, pretending that the injustice did not hurt us or that our boundaries were never breached. But deep Buddhist insight reveals that the raw energy of your anger is actually a highly concentrated form of survival fuel, a potent force that only becomes destructive when it is exposed to the endless oxygen of your mental rehearsals. When you open the drafts of your mind to replay the grievance, the fire consumes your sleep, leaving nothing but the cold, useless ash of exhaustion. But if you can learn to contain that heat beneath a thick blanket of immediate physical presence, the fire stops screaming and begins to cure your heart into a solid, unshakable stability. Maybe you have felt this too, the agonizing loop of wanting to let go of a grudge, while simultaneously feeling that if you stop raging, you are somehow letting the other person win or leaving yourself entirely unprotected. We treat the presence of anger as a dangerous deficit, spending our vital nighttime hours throwing new arguments into the furnace, believing that our thoughts can manually fix a past that cannot be rewritten. This reaction only adds a second wound of chronic fatigue to the initial sting of the betrayal. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the cool air travel deep into your lower abdomen, moving far beneath the hot points of your face, entering the wide, quiet earth of your pure physical presence. Nothing is required of you now, and there is absolutely nothing you need to force. Imagine leaving behind the loud, burning furnaces of your daily conflicts and stepping into a damp, silent cedar forest clearing ringed by ancient mossy trenches. In this dark sanctuary, the ground is blanketed by a thick, heavy layer of moist sod, resting undisturbed in the shadows, completely unbothered by the arguments of the village below. There are no scorecards here, no juries to convince, and no defensive lines for you to maintain through the night. There is only the cool, earthy texture of the woodland floor and the immense reassurance of a pit that knows how to hold an intense heat without catching the forest alight. You have arrived at a place where you can finally stop fanning the flames of your story, stepping into a sensory world that allows you to trade the burning friction of resentment for the dense, cooling quiet of a grounded night. Deep within the heavily shaded slopes of the northern valley, where the mountain air always smelled of damp cedar needles and rotting oak leaves, lived a young woodcutter named Jiro. He was a man of immense physical strength, yet his inner world was completely paralyzed by a hot, agonizing resentment that made his chest burn every time the sun set behind the ridges. Jiro had spent 3 long years clearing a rich tract of timberland in partnership with a childhood friend, only for that friend to falsify the boundaries on the village registry, claiming the entire profit and leaving Jiro's reputation completely ruined among the elders. The betrayal was absolute, and Jiro's mind had become a non-stop, nocturnal furnace, drafting angry confrontations and rehearsing legal arguments until his teeth were worn flat from grinding them in his sleep. He felt like an open hearth exposed to a gale, his life energy consumed by a fierce desire to see his former partner publicly humiliated. He was utterly convinced that if he stopped fanning this internal rage for even a single evening, he would be admitting defeat and letting the injustice stand as the final truth of his existence. Unable to endure the suffocating heat in his own cottage, Jiro marched up a steep, narrow trail that wound into the deepest, unmapped part of the old-growth forest. He was seeking an elderly hermit named Daisuke, a legendary charcoal burner, who had lived alone in a damp clearing for more than 40 years, completely removed from the politics of the lower village. When Jiro stepped into the quiet clearing, the chaotic noise of his thoughts met an entirely different sensory rhythm. The air inside the grove was cool, thick with moisture, and heavy with the dense, mineral scent of cold carbonized oak and wet clay. Old Daisuke was not moving quickly. He was kneeling at the edge of a massive earthen mound, his bare hands slowly smoothing a large, damp block of freshly dug woodland turf across a narrow opening in the soil. Jiro approached the old man, his breathing shallow and loud, his voice trembling with a long-hoarded fury as he laid bare his internal wound. He spoke of the stolen timber, the forged documents, and the white-hot vengeance that prevented his body from softening. When he lay down at night, he begged Daisuke to give him a method to sustain his anger without burning out, some spiritual focus that would make his determination as sharp and destructive as a double-edged axe so he could finally reclaim his honor. The old charcoal burner listened to the entire story without dropping his gaze, his hand remaining perfectly still against the block of wet sod. When the young woodcutter finally ran out of breath, his face flushed with the heat of his memories, the elder reached down into the trench at his feet and lifted a raw block of freshly dug, heavy woodland turf, placing it directly into Jiro's calloused palms. The turf was freezing cold, dripping with black forest moisture, and encrusted with thick green moss that felt like ice against Jiro's burning skin. Daisuke did not quote a single line of scripture. Instead, he led Jiro over to a smaller experimental earth pit dug into the center of the clearing. Inside the pit, a pile of green oak logs was smoldering intensely, sending a sharp, blinding column of white smoke straight up into the low branches. The heat radiating from the hole was immense, crackling with an erratic, volatile energy that threatened to turn into an open forest fire if a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees. Daisuke pointed to a stack of unmanaged wood nearby that had been left exposed to the open air the previous winter. "Look at what happens when the fire is given all the oxygen it demands," the elder whispered, his voice low and dense, like the moving earth. He pointed to a pile of pale, useless white ash that drifted away into the brush with the slightest breath of wind, leaving behind absolutely nothing of substance. Then, without a word of explanation, Daisuke signaled for Jiro to lay his heavy block of damp turf directly over the open, smoking mouth of the active pit, choking out the draft of air entirely. Jiro hesitated, fearing that smothering the fire would extinguish its power completely. But he did as he was told, pressing the wet, mossy sod down until the white smoke stopped pouring into the sky. Beneath the heavy, moist blanket of earth, the erratic cracking of the logs began to slow down, the fierce, blinding glare disappearing into a dark, self-contained chamber of soil. The heat did not vanish from the clearing, rather it stopped screaming, its volatile energy dropping down into the dense, silent core of the wood, buried deep beneath the forest floor. "Which material do you wish to carry in your heart when you return to the village?" Daisuke asked, his old eyes reflecting the quiet dark of the mound. "Do you want to be the open draft that turns your strength into a handful of drifting white ash? Or do you want to be the earth that forces the heat to turn the wood into stone?" Jiro stood perfectly still in the damp grass, looking down at his soot-stained fingers and then at the sealed mound where the intense heat was currently curing the oak in absolute silence. A profound moment of emotional recognition passed through his chest, loosening the rigid muscles around his jaw that had been locked for months. He realized that his constant late-night overthinking and his frantic rehearsal of grievances were not defending his honor at all. They were simply the open drafts fanning his own destruction, burning away his vital rest and turning his spirit into weightless, scattered ash. By trying to keep the fire visible to the world, he was consuming himself from the inside out. He saw that the damp earth did not destroy the energy of the wood it contained, forcing the raw heat to bake out the impurities until what remained was completely solid, unbothered, and unyielding. The deep midnight was settling over the mossy trenches, now the dark canopy above the clearing blocking out the sky and absorbing every stray sound from the valley below. The cool, wet aroma of the forest floor hung suspended in the heavy air, grounding Jiro's somatic awareness in the immense, uncelebrated safety of the earth mound. Take a slow, deliberate breath, letting your own shoulders drop flat into this horizontal darkness, allowing your mind to rest upon the cool, damp texture of the protective turf as the internal fire begins to settle into the silent depth of the night. This old story from the quiet cedar clearing is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, unyielding stone, or entirely numb to the very real pain of being mistreated. It is not an invitation to pretend that a betrayal did not break your trust, or that the sting of a sharp injustice does not leave a genuine, throbbing bruise across your emotional landscape. It is showing us something much quieter, a profound shift in our internal posture that allows us to hold our own heat without letting it reduce our vital resources to dust. When we sit in the dark and look at our latenite resentment, we begin to see that the deep, suffocating exhaustion we carry does not actually come from the initial event itself. The true suffering, the knot that locks your jaw and turns your chest into a furnace, was not only in what happened, but in the specific way the mind continues to hold what happened long after the conflict has ended. In our modern inner lives, what we call attachment is that frantic, burning urge to force the world to acknowledge our pain and rewrite the past in our favor. It is the desperate craving for absolute vindication, a silent demand that the person who hurt us must understand the depth of their error before we give ourselves permission to relax our muscles. This craving operates exactly like an open draft in an earthen pit, continually feeding the embers of our memory with the fresh oxygen of our mental arguments, believing that if we keep the anger roaring, we are keeping ourselves safe. We become like a watchman who stands too close to his own signal fire, completely blind to the reality that fanning the flames of our story does not punish the person who crossed us. It simply burns away our own structural capacity to heal. The ancient insights of Buddhist wisdom help us stop adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is the baseline injury that life brought to your doorstep, the unfair text, the stolen credit, the broken promise, or the simple truth that an individual you trusted acted from a place of blind selfishness. These events are painful, and they leave a real, stinging heat in their wake. The second wound, however, is the massive edifice of resentment, self-judgment, and endless latenite trial scenes that we build around that initial sting. It is the secondary spiral where the mind convinces us that if we stop replaying the grudge for even an hour, we are becoming weak or letting the injustice win. This continuous fanning of our own furnace is what truly depletes our body, trapping our nervous system in a permanent nocturnal alarm that refuses to let the heart cool down. When we practice true mindfulness in our emotional life, we are simply learning how to place a heavy, damp blanket of awareness over the screaming open draft of our thoughts. This awareness is the quiet, grounding quality of the mind that can notice the burning heat of a memory without choosing to step directly into the fire. It is the capacity to feel the hot pulsing in your temples and say, "There is a fierce heat here in my body," rather than, "I must solve this injustice before morning." By shifting our relationship with this internal energy, letting go ceases to mean passive surrender or weakness. Instead, letting go becomes an act of immense, quiet discipline, the willingness to close the drafts of your mind, containing the raw emotion beneath the soil of your physical presence, until the volatile cracking of the thoughts stops vibrating through your limbs. Impermanence, when felt deeply within the somatic self, becomes a source of profound stability rather than a cause for fear. Every raging conflict, every ungrateful remark, and every high-stakes drama of the daytime eventually loses its momentum, cools down, and returns to the silent baseline of the earth. The situations that seem so permanent and all-consuming during the heat of an argument are subject to the same decay as a pile of green oak logs. A temporary lack of justice cannot permanently destroy your internal integrity, unless you continuously throw your own vital energy into the furnace to keep the grievance alive. Wisdom reminds us that the loudest fires quickly turn themselves into weightless, scattered white ash that blows away into the brush, while the heart that knows how to contain its own heat becomes as dense, unyielding, and self-contained as charcoal deep beneath the frost. Compassion, in this earthy light, is the soft, moist sod that meets your own hot resentment without turning your frustration into a source of personal shame. It is the willingness to look at the angry, defensive part of your mind and recognize that this burning loop is not a defect in your character. It is simply a tired, ancient part of your survival biology that has been staying awake to protect your borders, believing that if it stops fighting for your honor, you will be left entirely exposed to the world. By meeting this internal furnace with a cool, non-judgmental physical presence, you allow the volatile steam to escape safely, transforming the destructive glare into a solid grounding weight. In a moment, this horizontal clarity will move from an idea you listen to into a physical blanket of earth you can truly rest your entire chest beneath. The cool, damp air within our quiet forest clearing remains perfectly still, totally unbothered by the heavy arguments of the village below. The sealed earth mounds hold their immense heat in absolute, dignified silence, allowing the moss to grow over their slopes without any need to prove their power to the wind. Take another slow, intentional breath, letting the hot static in your forehead sink flat as we prepare to guide the mind into a much deeper state of physical relaxation. If it feels right, allow the physical contours of your body to expand slightly outward, surrendering your entire weight into the broad, unmoving foundation that supports you tonight. There is no need to engineer an artificial stillness within your mind, nor is there any requirement to alter the simple, automatic rhythm of your breathing as it passes quietly across your lips. Perhaps you can simply observe the cool, neutral air entering your nostrils, unhurried and soft, leaving a light trace of moisture as it exits your frame. With each slow exhalation, you might allow the sharp edges of your shoulders, your chest, and the small hypervigilant muscles around your eyes to lose their tight boundaries. Imagine your physical self sinking down into the dense, dark baseline of the mattress, dropping the defensive posture of the day completely, like an unmanaged branch that has finally fallen into the soft carpet of the forest floor. As you lie here in the deep shadow of your room, you might shift your internal focus away from the vertical, straining territory of the temples and the throat, allowing your center of gravity to settle deep into the base of your spine. For many hours, your vital energy has been pulled upward into a hot, vibrating knot of resentment, tensing like wood exposed to a fierce wind as you tried to manually defend your character and replay an old injury. Right now, there is no need to force that momentum to vanish instantly. Even noticing the faint, rhythmic movement of your lower abdomen as it rises and falls is entirely enough. You do not have to perform this meditation perfectly to prove your spiritual integrity to an invisible judge. There is no score being kept in this room, no penalty for carrying a heavy heart, and absolutely nothing you are required to fix before you are permitted to drop your effort into the dark. In this open, non-judgmental space of your own awareness, you might allow one specific, recurring thought or memory from your day to appear without trying to fight its presence. Perhaps it is a biting remark that left you feeling completely invisible, an unfair situation where your boundaries were disregarded, or a persistent urge to stay awake to mentally settle a score with someone who wronged you. Do not try to aggressively push this memory out of your head, and do not dive into its details to argue with the person in your imagination tonight. Instead, if it feels right, you can name the emotional pattern softly to yourself, perhaps using the silent word rehearsing. defending or fanning the flame. Recognizing the habit in this gentle way is enough to create a small, cool distance between your core self and the heat of the grievance. Once you have named the pattern, you might imagine taking that entire, burning narrative and placing it gently into the center of the deep earthen pit dug into the mossy ground of the quiet forest clearing. Let the moist, ancient soil hold the entire weight of that unresolved conflict for you. In your imagination, you can reach down and pick up that raw block of freshly dug, heavy woodland turf, freezing cold, encrusted with damp green moss and saturated with the dense, cooling moisture of the deep earth. Gently, without any sense of anger or violence, you might place that heavy sod directly over the open, smoking mouth of your frantic thoughts, closing the draft of air completely. There is no need to force a sudden catharsis or to demand that your heart instantly forgive the injury. You are simply closing the vents to let the volatile smoke settle down into the earth. Watch what happens to that image when you stop feeding the memory with the fresh oxygen of your mental arguments. You might notice that as you leave the worry resting beneath the heavy, damp blanket of turf, the erratic, cracking tension of your overthinking naturally begins to lose its velocity. The thick, moist sod does not fight the heat, it contains it, holding the fiery glare perfectly still within a dark, self-contained chamber of earth until the volatile steam naturally runs out of momentum. The urgent necessity to vindicate yourself to the village begins to dissolve, replaced by the deep, mineral density of a presence that is far too grounded to be reduced to ash by another person's behavior. The fire stops screaming into the sky and begins the quiet, slow process of curing your heart into an unshakable baseline of inner peace. If your mind occasionally drifts back into its old habit of drafting defenses, or if a sudden wave of physical heat surfaces around your collarbones, remember that you can return to the cool, grounding texture of your breath whenever you are ready. There is no timeline you must follow tonight, and no one is asking you to promise your nervous system a state of permanent, immediate healing. True transformation does not happen by violently extinguishing your natural emotions, but by realizing that your awareness is like the vast forest, clearing itself capacious enough to let the heat smolder safely beneath the wet clay, without catching your entire house alight. Let each slow, unhurried breath feel like the natural closing of a draft, allowing your limbs to become heavy, porous, and completely unresponsive to the urgent static of the daytime world. In a moment, our journey will return to the damp oak grove, following Jiro as the seasons shift and bring an unexpected encounter that will test the true density of his cooled heart. The deep, dark textures of the hermit's clearing will continue to open a path toward an absolute, indestructible form of inner sovereignty. For now, simply allow yourself to remain right here, unmoving and encased in this protective shadow, letting each breath sink you an inch deeper into the vast, silent safety of the night. 3 full seasonal cycles passed over the mountain ridges, burying the narrow forest tracks under deep drifts of pine needles and winter frost before Jiro walked back down toward the lower valley. The dynamic of his life had settled into a quiet, rhythmic pattern of basic labor. Yet the true depth of his internal stabilization had not yet been tested by the unpredictable currents of human interaction. One chilly autumn morning, while stacking freshly split cedar blocks near the village river dock, Jiro turned around and found himself standing less than 3 paces from his former business partner. The man had not thrived. His corrupt dealings had eventually been discovered by a powerful merchant guild from the capital, resulting in the total seizure of his stolen timberlands and leaving him impoverished, physically broken, and forced to scavenge for scraps of bark along the water's edge. As their eyes met in the gray river mist, a sudden blinding rush of the old, volatile heat flared up from the bottom of Jiro's stomach, threatening to take over his throat and lock his jaw in an instant. The familiar internal furnace roared into life, fanning a wild impulse to mock the man's ruin, to loudly point out the cosmic justice of his downfall, and to finally collect the public vindication he had hoarded for 3 long years. His chest tightened like dry wood exposed to a sudden draft, and his mind immediately began to draft a searing speech that would cut through his old friend's remaining pride. It felt like the entire weight of the past had been compressed into a single, burning ember, demanding that he throw his vital presence back into the center of the old conflict to prove he had won. But as Jiro felt his fists clench against the handle of his woodhook, his gaze fell upon a blunt, hand-notched hazel measuring rod that stuck out from the top of the ruined man's tattered canvas pack. The tool was heavily stained with grease and coated in ancient soot from the lower kilns, a miserable, worn object that carried the precise markings of the timber boundaries they had once measured together. Seeing that soot-covered rod brought an immediate sensory memory of old Dasuke's quiet forest clearing the deep, cold trenches, the damp, mossy mounds, and the absolute unyielding density of the earth pits that knew how to hold a fierce heat without screaming into the sky. Jiro stood perfectly still in the river mist, the hot pulsing in his temples vibrating against the silence of the bank. Instead of launching into the ready argument or allowing his fury to dictate his movements, Jiro stopped completely and chose one small, quiet act of discipline. He closed his eyes for the space of a single, slow breath, letting the cool river air travel all the way down into his lower abdomen, moving far beneath the burning static of his initial evolutionary reaction. In that unhurried pause, a profound realization opened up within his chest, changing his relationship to his own suffering entirely. He looked at the fierce thought demanding vengeance and realized that he no longer had to treat that internal impulse as an absolute command that required his obedience. He saw that trying to crush the broken man with words would not rewrite the initial betrayal or restore the lost years. It would simply reopen the vents of his own internal pit, fanning the old drafts until his spirit was once again reduced to scattered, useless white ash. A wave of genuine, unvarnished compassion passed through Jiro's heart, not because he was pretending the initial hurt had never occurred, but because he saw that his former partner was currently trapped inside the very same burning furnace of greed and scarcity that had once ruined their friendship. Jiro did not offer a false embrace, nor did he look for an apology that would never come from a defensive heart. He simply stepped back from the edge of the dock, unlatched a heavy bundle of his finest cedar wood from his own sled, and laid it quietly on the damp stones at the broken man's feet without saying a single word. He did not look for gratitude, and he did not wait to see the expression on the man's face. He simply turned his back on the old furnace and walked away into the clearing, experiencing for the first time the immense, cool sovereignty of a heart that no longer required an external victory to feel secure. The winter mist was thickening across the gray river channels now, the damp air absorbing the distant sounds of the timber markets and wrapping the valley floor in a dense, uniform quiet. The mineral scent of the wet stones and the clean, resinous oil of the split cedar hung suspended in the heavy atmosphere, grounding Jiro's somatic awareness in the absolute reality of the present moment. He had not become a magically perfect saint, and the memory of the betrayal still carried a blunt, distant weight, but he had discovered a way to let the heat rest beneath the soil without burning away his peace. Take a slow, horizontal breath, letting your own shoulders sink flat into this level dark, allowing your mind to rest upon the cool, soot-stained wood of the measuring rod as it settles into the quiet depth of the night. When we track the heavy subterranean architecture of our Latinite suffering, we invariably discover a frantic, protective mechanism that mistakes internal combustion for psychological armor. We lie awake in the dense shadows of our rooms, our bodies held completely rigid while our minds run an unceasing, secondary processing loop that is utterly convinced it can fix a past injury through the sheer velocity of overthinking. This habit of turning a betrayal, an exclusion, or an unfair situation over and over in our memory is an instinctual attempt to regain control over a world that has proven itself to be fundamentally volatile and unpredictable. We believe, deep down, that if we keep the burning friction of our resentment alive, we are erecting a defensive perimeter that will prevent us from ever being caught off guard or left unprotected again. The true devastation of this process, however, does not lie in the external injustice itself, but in the silent, agonizing way we turn our wounded history into a fixed personal identity. When someone treats us unfairly or shatters our trust, the mind doesn't just experience the localized heat of that single event, it begins to weave the injury into a grand, defining monument of who we are. We become the wronged person, the one who was deceptively pushed to the side, the constant victim of another's selfishness. To maintain this heavy identity, we are forced to continuously feed the kiln, throwing our vital nighttime rest, our breathing, and our cellular energy into the furnace to keep the grievance from cooling down. We use self-judgment and shame as crude administrative tools, believing that if we can just review our failures and rehearse our defenses harshly enough, we can somehow force a volatile life into a shape that satisfies our craving for absolute validation. This is the precise juncture where the unhurried clarity of Buddhist insight offers a profound, grounding sanctuary for your tired spirit, translating the ancient mechanics of suffering into simple, emotional terms. True wisdom reveals that every difficult experience is composed of two entirely distinct elements. The first pain, which is what life brings to your door, and the second pain, which is what the mind adds through its desperate resistance to reality. The first pain is the raw, unvarnished impact of an unfair truth, the broken contract, the cutting remark from a family member, the loss of a shared plan, or the simple reality that a person you cared for acted from a place of deep systemic confusion. This initial sting is a localized occurrence that moves through your timeline, like a seasonal storm through a cedar grove. It leaves a real, throbbing heat, but it does not possess the capacity to permanently warp your fundamental value unless you choose to hoard the embers. The second pain, which is the true source of your midnight exhaustion, is the elaborate, suffocating furnace of catastrophic forecasting, historical regret, and invisible trial scenes that the mind builds around that initial wound. The second pain is the voice that takes an unpolished plateau or an unfair exclusion and transforms it into an absolute guarantee that you are fundamentally unprotected, deficient, or destined to be permanently left out of happiness. We do not possess the power to stop the changing winds of an erratic world from occasionally dropping a burning brand into our clearing, but we have the absolute capacity to stop opening the drafts of our intellect to fan the flames. Every time you notice your mind drafting a brilliant defense or a biting counter-argument at 3 in the morning, and you choose instead to drop your awareness back into the dense, dark baseline of your mattress, you are choking out the oxygen that keeps the second pain alive. Peace, when understood through this earthy lens, is never defined as the complete absence of difficulty, conflict, or emotional heat. True peace is simply a fundamentally different relationship with that difficulty when it arrives. It is the capacity to feel the hot pulsing in your temples and the tight contraction in your chest, and realize that you can contain that raw survival energy beneath the damp sod of your immediate physical presence, without needing to turn it into an open forest fire. You begin to discover that an unresolved situation or an unwritten future is not an emergency that must be instantly solved before your body is permitted to soften. It is merely a pile of unmanaged wood resting in the dark, completely incapable of consuming your inner sovereignty unless you choose to give it your active obedience. By recognizing this internal mechanism, your relationship with your own overthinking shifts from a state of violent frustration to a quiet, spacious observation. You no longer need to exhaust your resources trying to force your mind into an artificial silence, nor do you need to condemn yourself for carrying a heavy heart after a betrayal. You can simply allow the heat to exist as a localized, passing sensation, trusting that the natural, horizontal mass of your body is wide enough to hold the raw energy until it stops vibrating through your limbs. You are no longer an overstrained branch ready to snap under the pressure of an old grudge. You are the vast, silent forest floor itself, dense, unyielding, and completely unbothered by the passing smoke of the lower valleys. In a moment, this grounding perspective will move directly into the concrete settings of your modern daily existence, exploring how to maintain this soft, contained posture amidst the specific triggers that usually disrupt your nightly rest. The cool, damp atmosphere within your room remains perfectly balanced, completely unconcerned with the frantic legal arguments that occupied your afternoon. Let your physical frame continue to surrender its remaining structure into this supportive darkness, allowing each slow, rhythmic breath to remind you that your safety is already solid, spacious, and entirely complete right now. This unyielding, Grounded sovereignty is not a detached concept meant to be locked away in a mountain clearing or reserved exclusively for an elderly charcoal burner, kneeling in the damp moss. True inner peace is practiced in the very small, unpolished friction points that make up the raw daily texture of your modern existence. It is found in that precise second when you are waiting for a critical text message, watching the small glass screen glow against the midnight darkness of your bedroom, and you feel that familiar, hot contraction in your stomach because the notification has not arrived on your timeline. In that moment, the old habit of your nervous system is to repeatedly wake the device, reaching for a superficial reassurance, treating the digital silence as an absolute emergency that requires an immediate, exhausting mental solution. True wisdom begins when you notice that urgent impulse, pause before touching the glass, and realize that the lack of an immediate response does not diminish your own internal density by a single strand. We live in an accelerated culture that constantly demands we act like open, roaring kilns, fanning our internal drafts to maintain a pleasant, flawless presentation, even when our interior landscape feels heavy, unraveled, and filled with a thick smoke of unspoken grievances. You might find yourself walking through a crowded afternoon meeting, smiling and nodding automatically to look cooperative, while a relentless loop of self-criticism plays behind your eyes about a minor mistake you made last week. We look at a social feed. We compare our private, unrefined struggles to the bright, geometric trajectories of those around us, and we immediately decide that we are falling hopelessly behind the conventional design of a successful life. The mind creates a false sense of absolute urgency, telling you that if you do not instantly fix your status, your loneliness, or your fractured relationship dynamics by tomorrow morning, you will be permanently excluded from safety. But a profound transformation occurs when you discover that not every frantic thought deserves your active obedience, and not every anxious feeling is an absolute command that requires a reaction. When you feel a sudden surge of resentment prompting you to write a searing reply or force an immediate confrontation, you can choose to simply sit with the raw texture of the uncertainty rather than running to manipulate the situation. Taking a slow, heavy breath before responding to an email or reacting to a challenging remark from a family member is a form of immense internal discipline. It is a way of demonstrating to your own body that you are no longer a fragile branch that will burst into open flames at the slightest pull of the wind. You can care deeply about the individuals in your world without gripping their emotional states so tightly that you fracture your own core. You can support them from a place of dense, self-contained mass, like a cool earth mound resting securely in the shadows, rather than as an overstrained wire waiting to be broken by a change in the weather. This also means that you are entirely permitted to drop into an absolute, deep rest tonight without needing to earn it through a day of flawless productivity or external validation. Many of us carry a heavy, silent guilt the moment our bodies try to soften, believing that if we are not actively weaving, planning, or resolving a conflict for our environment, we are failing. But your fundamental value as a living presence is not a commercial product that fluctuates based on how many arguments you managed to settle before the sun went down. You do not have to settle your entire destiny before you are allowed to close your eyes, nor do you need to apologize for seeking a sanctuary from the relentless noise of the lower valleys. Rest is not a luxury reserved for those who have achieved a perfect pattern of life. It is the natural, native right of a physical frame that belongs to the heavy, uncarved bedrock of the world. Let this unpatterned perspective occupy your physical awareness right now as you lie beneath the heavy covers of your bed. When the memory of an old blunder or a bitter betrayal tries to pull your attention back up into the hot, friction-filled air of overthinking, let the sheer weight of your bones serve as your anchor, pulling you straight down into the immediate dark. You can acknowledge that the difficult event occurred without allowing it to dictate the shape of your current night. By choosing to let the memory sit on your surface beneath a thick, moist blanket of non-judgmental presence, you are gradually retraining your mind to understand that it is safe to step down from the furnace. In a moment, the final echoes of these modern applications will begin to cool down entirely, letting the teaching pass from language into pure, inert sleep. The space surrounding your bed is growing increasingly heavy, the dark air absorbing your presence without a single condition, measurement, or judgment. You do not need to hold a rigid design for anyone. Tonight, you are simply a loose, unknotted fringe resting undisturbed in the deep shadows of the room, completely hidden, completely non-reactive, and absolutely safe in your own quiet night. The active, volatile fire of your thoughts is beginning to lose its draft now, cooling down into the quiet corners of the room, like a heavy layer of damp woodland soil settling over a deep, dark forest pit when the long day's heat has spent its energy. The absolute necessity to build an argument, the habit of tracking these grievances, and the drive to fix your life can all be left behind on the mossy ground tonight. Your physical frame is becoming intensely weighted, dropping into the level support of the bedding with an immense absolute gravity that cannot be countered by a restless memory or a midnight calculation. The wide muscles of your lower jaw are entirely relaxed. Your throat is cool and spacious, and your eyes are blanketed by a dense, unreacting shade that has no desire to scan the dark for a missing apology. Let the internal cadence of your pulse drop into a slow, grounding movement, sinking into the deep, unthreaded chamber that holds your rest. There is not a single problem left for you to solve tonight. The busy administrative markets of the daytime have been locked up from the inside. The erratic cracking of the logs has stopped, and the voices that demanded you justify your boundaries have withdrawn into the shadows of the lower valley. You do not need to take your logistics, your scores, or your defensive habits under the blankets with you. Let yourself slip entirely out of the heavy, rigid harness that you wore to navigate the friction of a demanding world. You are entering a wide, quiet sanctuary where no arguments are pulled taut, no grievances are being appraised, and no one is calculating your value based on your visible presentation. The quiet atmosphere holds your skeleton with an absolute, unmoving security, treating your weariness as a natural, necessary return to the raw, uncarved baseline of the earth. Let your awareness sink all the way down into the heavy bones of your hips, far beneath the high, vertical structures where resentments are continually rehearsed. Imagine your entire presence as a vast, silent mound filled with dense, cooling charcoal, sinking slowly into the cool, dark comfort of an uncelebrated night. The world may continue to move in its own erratic rhythm, and the unpredictable future may continue to vibrate on the surface. But down here on the forest floor, there is only a spacious, self-contained silence. You are resting on a foundation that is far too deep to be moved by the passing white ash of an old conflict. With each slow, unhurried exhalation, you are shedding the evolutionary urge to defend yourself through constant mental labor. Let the heavy darkness of the night wrap around your shoulders like a protective, damp blanket of turf, dampening every residual signal, cradling your tired chest in a permanent stillness. You have permission to abandon the watchtower now. You have permission to let the coming months remain completely unwritten, to drop the soot-stained measuring rod into the dust, and to simply allow your consciousness to unwind into the solid density of the unconditioned dark. Gradually, the mind untethers itself from the necessity of an immediate victory, sliding out into a deep, vast landscape of sleep where no variables need to be manually held under tension. The breathing has turned into a faint automatic whisper, a slow and horizontal tide moving through an interior world that has entirely forgotten the rhythm of comparison. You are safe here in the hidden dark, completely unreacting, completely contained, and profoundly whole in your own open space. When the fire stops screaming into the wind and settles deep beneath the sod, what if the silence you finally found was always more powerful than the flame? This profound containment expands through your awareness like the slow, deep cooling of the earth hours after the autumn winds have swept the smoke from the ridges. As you lie perfectly still against the support of the bed, let the understanding sink deep into your chest that your fundamental peace does not require you to constantly defend your perimeter or wage an internal war against the past. We spend our waking hours treating our sense of honor like a fragile ember that will die if we do not continuously fan it with our own fury, believing that our anger is the only thing keeping us from being erased. But the unyielding reality of your presence is that it cannot be diminished by an unreturned text, an unacknowledged truth, or a localized act of betrayal. Your core being is the very ground in which all these transient storms spend their force, a baseline that remains absolutely solid, spacious, and unshakable regardless of how many unresolved conflicts still linger in the valley below. Consider how the massive earth mound in the center of the clearing does not mourn the wood that has been transformed within its depths. It does not look back at the initial heat with a sense of panic, nor does it strain its internal structures to explain its process to the passing wind. It simply holds its position with an immense, majestic density, completely content to be exactly what it is, a quiet, cooling sanctuary that asks for nothing but the freedom to rest undisturbed in the dark. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of stillness tonight, letting go of the exhausting psychological requirement to be an administrator of justice, a fixer of old mistakes, or an active combatant in a story that has already run its course. You can let the world move in its own erratic rhythm, knowing that your inner landscape is far too vast to be fractured by an unwritten future. Let this release travel deep into your physical frame, softening the final, subconscious anchors of tension that still linger behind your collarbones and beneath your shoulder blades. For so long, your body has been trained to treat an unanswered injury as a dangerous vacuum that must be immediately filled with plans, counterattacks, or self-criticism to keep you alert. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical relaxation, you can begin to see that this constant internal labor is an unnecessary weight we add to the natural silence of the evening. You do not have to fight the passing thoughts that float across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into an artificial numbness. You can simply allow the memory to exist as a faint, harmless echo beneath the soil of your physical presence, trusting that it will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to give it the oxygen of your attention. Think of the immense relief that arrives when you step out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a public victory or a flawless presentation. The old habit of checking for reassurance, of replaying a conversation to see if you were approved of by the village, has absolutely no meaning in this midnight environment. There is no audience here to judge your progress, no ledger tracking your daily output, and no standard you must achieve to be worthy of this profound rest. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine carbon particles melting back into a quiet mountain. The structural understanding has moved past the level of words now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws you down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the earth. The events of the day, the messages left waiting, the minor anxieties, the persistent whisper that you are falling behind your peers are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the clearing. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival, or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This seamless completion expands into the surrounding space like the slow, quiet cooling of the clay hearth after the embers have turned to soft gray ash. As you lie perfectly still against the support of the bed, let the understanding sink deep into your awareness. that you do not need to hold yourself under tension to ensure that your life has meaning. We spend our waking hours treating our peace of mind like a delicate fabric that will be ruined by a single loose thread, constantly striving to maintain an immaculate exterior for the world to evaluate. But the profound reality of your presence is that it cannot be diminished by an empty calendar, an unresolved transition, or an unwritten future. Your core being is the very space in which all these shifting seasons unfold, a ground that remains absolutely solid, spacious, and unshakable regardless of how much or how little you have achieved today. Consider how the old cedar workbench in the corner of the room does not grieve when the tools are laid down and the workspace falls silent for the night. It does not look back at the morning's labor with regret, nor does it tense its grain in anticipation of what the craftsman will bring to its surface tomorrow. It simply holds its position with an immense majestic density, completely content to be exactly what it is, a quiet, unpatterned foundation that asks for nothing but the freedom to rest in the dark. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of stillness tonight, letting go of the exhausting psychological requirement to be an answer to every problem, a manager of every outcome, or a perfect reflection of society's expectations. You can let the world move in its own erratic rhythm, knowing that your inner landscape is far too vast to be fractured by an uncelebrated hour. Let this release travel deep into your physical frame, softening the small, subconscious anchors of tension that still linger behind your chest and beneath your shoulder blades. For so long, your body has been trained to treat a quiet margin as a dangerous vacuum that must be immediately filled with plans or self-criticism to justify your presence. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical relaxation, you can begin to see that this constant internal labor is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural silence of the evening. You do not have to fight the passing thoughts that float across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into an artificial numbness. You can simply allow the worry to exist as a faint, harmless echo on your surface, trusting that it will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense relief that arrives when you step out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless productivity. The old habit of checking for reassurance, of comparing your private struggles to the bright, edited milestones of those around you, has absolutely no meaning in this midnight environment. There is no audience here to judge your progress, no ledger tracking your daily output, and no standard you must achieve to be worthy of this profound rest. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like a grain of salt melting back into a quiet ocean. The structural understanding has moved past the level of words now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws you down toward the threshold of total rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the earth. The events of the day, the messages left waiting, the minor anxieties, the persistent whisper that you are falling behind your peers, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the coastline. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival, or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide horizontal presence, resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This timeless baseline of existence requires no constant defense or modification. as it remains the uncarved anchor of your awareness, resting silently beneath the shifting memories of the day like the deep, ancient peat beds supporting the quiet forest floor. We spend our waking hours treating our peace of mind like a temporary structure that will collapse if we do not constantly monitor its alignment, striving to maintain an immaculate, unblemished presentation for a world that loves to criticize. But the true, unyielding reality of your presence is that it cannot be permanently warped by an unanswered communication, an unacknowledged contribution, or a sudden change in another person's emotional weather. Your core being is the very clearing in which all these passing clouds gather and dissolve a ground that remains absolutely dense, self-contained, and complete regardless of how many unresolved arguments still echo through the valleys. Consider how the old hazel measuring rod, resting quietly against the cedar bench in the dark, does not retain the frantic heat of the measurements it took during the morning. It does not argue with the boundary line. It does not hold a grudge against the hand that gripped it too tightly. And it does not worry whether its tattered notch will be celebrated by the village elders tomorrow. It simply surrenders its physical mass to the absolute stillness of the room, completely content to return to its native, quiet state as an uncarved piece of mountain wood. You are entirely permitted to step into that same baseline of non-resistance tonight, letting go of the exhausting nocturnal requirement to be an answer to every injustice, an administrator of outcomes, or a perfect reflection of someone else's timeline. You can allow the external world to move in its own volatile currents, knowing that your inner landscape is far too grounded to be consumed by an unwritten hour. Let this release travel deep into your somatic self, softening the final, subconscious anchors of vigilance that still linger behind your ribs and around the base of your throat. For many seasons, your body has been conditioned to treat an unresolved grievance as an immediate emergency that must be instantly settled through a mental trial scene before you are permitted to rest. But as you sink deeper into this state of total physical surrender, you can begin to see that this constant internal labor is an unnecessary friction we add to the natural stillness of the night. You do not have to fight the anxious thoughts that drift across your mind, nor do you need to use shame to force your brain into a state of artificial silence. You can simply allow the hot memory to sit on your surface beneath a thick, cooling blanket of non-judgmental presence, trusting that its erratic cracking will naturally run out of momentum if you simply refuse to feed it with your active attention. Think of the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step completely out of the illusion that your worth as a living presence is something that must be earned through a day of flawless productivity or a public vindication. The old habit of checking your device for reassurance, of comparing your private, unpolished timeline to the bright, edited milestones of those around you, has absolutely no function in this midnight sanctuary. There is no audience here to evaluate your progress, no ledger tracking your emotional output, and no standard you must achieve to be worthy of this profound dark. You are completely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine ash drifting down into a quiet stream. The structural understanding has moved past the level of language now, transforming into a heavy, soothing gravity that gently draws your awareness down toward the threshold of absolute rest. The darkness enveloping your resting frame remains perfectly still, a soft and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let your spirit drop flat against the mattress. The events of the day, the messages left waiting, the minor frustrations, the persistent whisper that you are not doing enough to stay ahead of the crowd, are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into weightless, gray shadows that naturally vanish into the immense calm of the forest floor. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival or trying to force a shape out of an unpredictable world. You are simply a wide, horizontal presence resting securely on the flat floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly complete in your own quiet night. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide, carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is.